Okay, everyone, welcome back to yet another episode of Season 3 of Living Room Logic, me and Andrew's beautiful, blossoming baby of podcasting. And again, this is another slightly different episode in that one of the hosts actually knows what we're talking about and has not had to do a week of extreme cramming into the topic we are covering. So, today we're going to be, I'm interviewing Andrew, our lovely, deep-voiced, beautiful, handsome man, who just so happens to be a neuroscientist. And he studies differences in men and women in terms of neurological diseases of the brain. And so the first question I have for you, Andrew, is why are you focusing your research particularly on women?
Yeah, it's a funny one because if you asked me 5 years ago, I would have not even been aware of why.
Yeah.
And like when I went to college and when I was looking for college courses, I knew I liked science. I knew I liked things that were unknown. So for me, the two things I was going towards was like astrophysics and neuroscience. And those were my two on the CAO to go to college. And I didn't get the points for neuroscience. I got the points for astrophysics. So I got that offer. And then I got like a turn of events that through the like higher education access route from like, if you're from an impoverished area, they bring a few of us stragglers in.
Okay.
And that's the only reason I got into neuroscience.
Wow.
So like, yeah, so pure, we could be having a much more interesting conversation
about astrophysics.
But, so my whole thing was, I really wanted to pursue something that we were really clueless about. And neuroscience is obviously a wide open field as far as we know a ton and we know infinitely less. We know crazy amount. We are barely aware of how little we know. Okay, because it's so complicated. And when I was going through neuroscience, I kept seeing things about sex differences and differences between men and women, and I was like, as far as I can tell, throughout the history of science, there have been men and women, and I was like, it's kind of strange that we're so perplexed by differences. And I went into the history of it a bit. And there's absolutely horror stories in the history of it. Because in the history of medicine, it was very much so, they would test it in men. And then if it's good enough for men, it works for women. They were like, yeah, that's fine.
God. Yeah.
And but this was absolute disasters. There were studies of breast cancer that would give a treatment for breast cancer and only do those clinical trials in men. And we're talking like thousands of men, even though it's and this is breast cancer. This is something that's 95+% in women. There was morning sickness pills, the thalidomide incidence in the 60s, where it was a morning sickness pill that was put on the market after testing in men, and then it was given to pregnant women. And it proved to cause developmental defects in the baby. And obviously they didn't realize until 9 months later, until it was taken off the market. Why? Because this bloody tablet wasn't tested in women, right? And the thing that really shocked me about this happened in like the 60s, and there's a ton of stories that I could go into, but let's not, about this. It wasn't until the 1990s that the FDA in the States actually said, right, to get a drug on the market, you have to test it in women. It wasn't until the 1990s, right? And since 2010, the majority is something like 85% of the drugs that had been taken off the market retrospectively had been taken off the market for having more severe side effects in women. Okay? And this circles back to the fact that they weren't tested in women in the first place, and they got on the market. This is still continuing to this day. It wasn't until 2015 that preclinical studies, so studies in animals and in cells, that you had to really test women, and that if you're applying for any grants like with Research Ireland or Science Foundation Ireland, you have to at least explain how you're going to address the issue of sex and gender in your study. because it is showing to be more diverse. But that's 2015, Abe.
Oh my!
It's
goodness.
2015. So if you're trying to think of how the thing that kind of blows my mind is that for me, I'm like, yeah, every human who's ever come to life has had a mother and has had a father of some degree. They have had grandparents. And it's like, how has this been missed? How bloody obvious is it that there are individual differences between males and females, right?
Yeah, and
it's crazy. So, yeah.
Could I interject there and just say, like, could you maybe map out what are the specific differences between men and women that make all of this so?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are 4 main components that we think about when we're thinking about sex differences, right? There is the genetic difference. Okay, we all heard about our XX and our XY, that 23rd chromosome pair. And that is the key genetic difference. You get 2 X's if you're a girl, one from mom, one from dad, and an X and a Y, the X from your mom and the Y from your dad. And this is your typical genetics. These are the genes that drive certain differences.
Yeah.
So that's fine. And these genetics drive much of the other biological things. And the next one is your early life development. So people often think that you don't get any hormones until puberty. But in literally the first day to 3 days of life, your ovaries and your testicles will produce a huge hormonal surge.
Yeah.
Right? And what this hormonal surge will do is it will actually organize and begin driving your brain in slightly different areas to be sexually dimorphic. And what this means is to be different sizes and different shapes. Yeah. Okay? And a few of these are in areas like sexual behavior. A few of these are just in other different subtle ways. And I can go into that in more detail in a bit. But this is the first one where the second you're born, not only do you have, the anatomical difference, but the hormones that are released then drive brain architecture differences. Okay. The next one that comes out is puberty. Okay. And hormones have a massive effect on puberty. And it's the essence of it. Girls typically go through puberty earlier, and they receive a lot of estrogens from their ovaries, and it drives a physical change. Okay, and it drives a physical change. It redistributes where fat goes on their body. It drives the secondary sexual characteristics development. Okay, and it's the same with testosterone in men, but men typically get it a bit older. And what's a little interesting about that is that women physically, like their body it matures quicker than men's. However, their brain is still at the same level of immaturity. And this is quite an interesting thing because it's pinned back to a lot of mental health differences in men and women in early life, because women are treated like adults sooner than men just because they look like adults, not because they are adults.
Okay.
And you'd have like kids in, first, third class who would be the same age. You'd have Timmy, who is 4.5 foot, and you'd have Sarah, who is 5'8". And they are biologically in their brain both kids. They're both children.
Yeah.
But you're going to treat Sarah like an adult. Just because you look at it, and it takes away and it adds a pressure and a stress. And this continues throughout life. And then in later life, hormones tend to decline in both men and women. But whilst men, they get testosterone and it declines in old age particularly. But in women, it's very different because women have the menstrual cycle. And this is a global change in hormones throughout their life that moves up and down, up and down. Then they can go through pregnancy as well, which is another huge shift in hormones. These are things that men don't at all worry about, but it is another huge shift in hormones.
Of course.
And then they go through menopause, which is a complete deprivation of hormones. And it's another massive changing event in their body that affects their whole system globally. And this is something, again, that makes the way that they are physiologically a bit different. And the last stage of what's different between men and women is the social and environmental factors at play. Because we have lived in a society which has treated and expected different things from men and women.
Yeah.
And how those different social pressures absolutely does have an impact. But from a biological standpoint, we kind of have to focus on what we can control. And we kind of look at it from a psychological standpoint and an environmental standpoint to see how it interacts, because it's very hard to control what happens outside. So a lot of what I work on is primarily on the genetic, the early life hormones and the hormones throughout life and how that changes.
Really interesting. And so there's very clear differences in physiology and development, all of these things. How do they turn into differences in the way men and women get neurological diseases?
Yeah, so this is particularly upsetting for me because, I was kind of thinking, right, well, it's hugely obvious that men and women are different. It's hugely obvious that men and women have different lifetime events happening in their body and things like that.
Yeah.
And I was like, right, okay, so perhaps there's a few diseases that maybe are 10% more likely in men or 5% more likely women. Maybe, perhaps it was such a subtle difference.
It was subtle, yeah.
That we missed it. And, I could get over that. But I can't, because it's not. Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia. It's something that a lot of people will get in their lifetime. Twice as many women than men get Alzheimer's. Parkinson's disease is a neurodegenerative motor neuron disease, right? Which changes and you lose neurons in a certain part of your brain, which is responsible for controlling motion and inhibiting unwanted motion. So you get a lot of people with Parkinson's who maybe have shakes and things like that.
Yeah.
50% more people with Parkinson's are men than women.
Wow.
We can look at other things as well. It's not just this kind of degenerative stuff. You can look at autism. 4-to-1. It is 400% more common in men than women. And this is a completely different side of it. Yeah, it's so you have 4 males with autism to 1 woman with autism. Wow. And now this used to be even higher. This used to be 6-to-1. But they're getting better and better at diagnosing autism. And what they were originally saying was that the way that it was between two things. They were saying that the way that society generally prepares men and women for life tends to be a little different, be it from marketing. Like you tend to get kids' trucks, so little boys' trucks, and you tend to get little girls' Barbies. This is a massive oversimplification, okay? But the tendencies tend to go that way. Yeah. But what that means is that young girls with autism would tend to have more exposure to social behavior younger. They would play with dolls and make pretend with that more often than men would. And then it would be the same. They would be pushed towards a particular kind of childhood party, for example, or socializing style that would be interacting with each other, whilst boys would be tending to be going towards interacting with things. And this would mask the autism at a younger age. And then it would be missed.
Interesting.
So between that and we're getting better and better at diagnosing autism. So that was a huge contributor, but it is still massively more so in men.
Wow.
ADHD is also 4-to-1 in men. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, okay, which a lot of people, there was a huge trend of people self-diagnosing, and then suddenly, once it was given more attention, there was a huge trend in diagnosing people with ADHD. Again, this might be something which is more common due to the way society is and the way that we have things like social media and stuff. Perhaps that's a driving factor. But again, this is another cognitive issue, which is more common in men. It's a 4-to-1 in men. And then we can go a completely different route, and we can have things like autoimmune disorders. Okay, autoimmune disorders like multiple sclerosis, for example, which is, again, it's a neurological degeneration of the insulation that goes around the neurons, where we pass electricity from A to B, information from A to B. That kind of gets destroyed, and it's by our own immune system. Our own immune system recognizes that and destroys it, and that is 3 times more common in women than men. So for every 3 women that have it, there's 1 man.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's extremely more complicated, because in the men that get it, the men tend to have worse symptoms.
Wow.
So it's again very complicated. And we have things like depression and anxiety, which are all more common in women, but they're also more fatal in men. So these are
very interesting.
It's crazy. And so we have neurodevelopmental, we have psychiatric, we have autoimmune, and we have neurodegenerative diseases, all of which have significant sex differences in their basis and or in their incidence, I should say, in the population of the world and in Ireland. So it really needs to be looked at.
Yeah. Okay. Wait. Okay. Yeah. That is all right. You've just blown my mind, by the way. I did not know a lot of that. It's really quite interesting. Particularly, I really didn't know about the autism or ADHD, that it's heavily skewed towards men.
Sure.
I actually also thought that depression and anxiety was more common in men, but that makes sense, that it is potentially more common in women and more fatal in men. Oh wow. So my next question is, how are pharmaceutical companies and the drug world treating this? Is there a difference in the drugs that treat men and women?
No, they're rubbish. It's not at all studied. It's like I said, they only tested in men and women because they had to in the 1990s. Before that, it was optional and you didn't really have to.
Oh my God.
We only started testing drugs preclinically in men and women in 2015.
Yeah.
In male rats and female rats, and in male cells and female cells. So the way that this is done is completely behind, and it's outrageous that it's behind. Because when I go through all those commonly known diseases and the massive sex differences and incidence, and you try to think that this is only something that has begun being studied as maybe having a sex-specific treatment strategy since the 1990s they tested, and most of the main information for how it will work comes preclinically. Nothing ever goes straight into humans. Yeah. And they've only started looking preclinically in 2015.
But
really?
Is that just an Irish thing?
No. This is This is worldwide. This is worldwide, and many countries still don't require it.
Wow.
This is kind of it worse. So this is what drives me insane, and this is where my research comes in. My research is, we're so far behind that my research right now is trying to show for the first time that someone's sex, their genetic XX or XY, and their hormones interact differently. So what I'm trying to show is that if you give a man estrogen, it interacts differently than if you give a woman estrogen. That they have slightly different effects, which is what we're seeing. That has not been done. We haven't fully got.
Andrew,
I'm serious. We're this far behind. And
sorry for stopping you, Andrew. My question is, you're testing for differences in terms of the response. What is it that you test? What is the specific change?
Yeah, so this is actually insanely complicated and really, really cool at the same time. So do you remember years ago when we got really excited because of the Human Genome Project?
Yes.
Where they mapped all of the different genes and stuff. And that seemed like a massive thing at the time.
Yeah.
But now it's actually quite, now we do things like transcriptomics, which is every single gene that you're expressing at any moment. And you can pay $4,000 and you can get it from whatever sample you sent.
Okay.
So the other thing that you can do is all of these genes, so all of the genes in your genetic makeup, they are translating into something you build, right? And the things that you tend to build are proteins. And it's the proteins that are functional. The proteins do the thing.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a wiggle room. Just because you show a gene is upregulated doesn't mean what that gene is translated into, the protein, is actually happening yet. You haven't proved that. So in science and the molecular and cellular sciences, we tend to focus on proteins. And that's like the final proof of the pudding. So what we did, we have a model, which was quite complicated, where what we did is we had male and female mice. After puberty, some of these mice were gonadectomized. So we took their testicles and we took their ovaries because we're horribly cruel and confusing people. And then some kept. And then later in their life, we then treated them with a hormonal therapy, right? And what we did, this led to something like 8 groups, okay? 8 groups that were all differently treated, male, female, gonads, no gonads, and gonads are your testicles and your ovaries, and hormonal therapy or no hormonal therapy. And we looked at the entire set of all of the thousands of proteins that are being expressed in a part of the brain at a moment. We took all of that and we compared each of the groups to identify what proteins are being upregulated, what are being downregulated, and what proteins are being differently regulated depending on if you give a hormonal therapy to a man or to a woman.
Okay.
And it's extremely complicated because what we do is we then group all of these different proteins that contribute some kind of function together into group functions. So maybe they clear waste. Maybe they produce energy. Maybe they are structural. Maybe they help, in organizing genes or translating genes or all of that cool different cellular stuff going on. And we group all the different proteins.
It's just insane how little is known.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like you guys are really at the forefront of something here. And you're almost going to kind of crack some really important stuff about our core understanding of what it means to be male or female, X or Y or whatever you want to call it.
Well, yes and no. The reason I say that is because medicine has made massive strides. And I don't think we're looking at it from a point of view that we're going to completely change it. That's not the movement. The movement is a movement called precision medicine, which is to optimize the approach for the individual.
Yeah.
Because this goes way back. It's really funny whenever we talk about like the cutting edge, because there's always a Greek who said it first. And it's like the father of modern medicine is Hippocrates, right?
Yeah.
And he said that you shouldn't treat the disease within the person, you should treat the person who has the disease. And that's where we're going. That's what we're looking at. We're trying to get to that place where at the bare minimum, which is the first level of precision medicine, for me at least, is are they male or are they female? I feel like it is the most...
And what is that doing?
And what is that doing? And it's very basic to say, are they male or are they female? But that's not it either. We're also looking at what level of hormones are in their body. Okay, maybe they're genetically XX, but what if they've gone through a hormonal replacement therapy to transition into a man? And we know nothing about that. We literally know nothing about how those things interact, but we do it.
And so it can sound kind of crude, Andrew, when you say... I'm looking at the difference between male and female, X and Y. But what I like so much about your research is that it is coming out of a place of inequality, and it is coming out of a place of compassion. It's like not even compassion. You said it yourself. You think it's crazy, and I think it's quite valiant what you're doing, because this needs to happen. Women need to be, anyone with 2 X chromosomes needs to be represented better in terms of the way that they are
absolutely. I think
treated for neurological diseases. It's insane.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I think it's completely insane. And I think what our research is trying to get to the point of a lot of it is we see a tendency that a lot of these differences in some diseases that are later life, a lot of it comes from menopause, because women tend to have a higher rate of cellular metabolism than men. Okay, so they tend to produce more energy and use it better, and then clear out the waste faster.
Yeah.
Than men, typically in an individual cell. This isn't a global thing. This is just inside the cell. The mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, really kicks more ass in a girl than a boy. Okay. And a lot of this seems to be driven by estrogen. And what we're kind of going into is that in menopause, which we know is a risk factor for a ton of autoimmune and neurodegenerative diseases in women. And I said earlier, things like Parkinson's is 50% more common in men.
Yeah.
But menopause is still a major risk factor for a woman getting it.
Yeah.
So what we're kind of seeing is that this hormonal influence is perhaps changing the risks for disease. And what we're just trying to show is that maybe a hormonal therapy might not work for men and women. But what if it just worked in women? And what if it just worked in men? Like, we could get to a place where a drug is only beneficial in men, but not women. Maybe it's only beneficial in women of this group. Maybe this is kind of where we're going, where perhaps we have turned down drugs in the past because we tested them across men and women. What if there were drugs that really would have cured this disorder, or treated this disorder effectively, but just in men?
That's so interesting. And it opens up so much doors for medicine. And just think of, I can just see it being so beneficial to medicine.
For sure.
You might have a ward where it's like, okay, we know that this treatment works in all the females in this room, and we know that this drug works a lot better in all of the men. And going back to the equality side of things, I think it needs to happen, and I think the awareness of this is something that I would love to see. Clearly you're doing a great job on making people more aware of this, but it is crazy that not more people know about this.
Yeah, and I think that mostly comes down to the lack of research around it.
Yeah.
Because the most common argument against it is, well, where's the evidence that this can happen?
Yeah.
And it's like, honestly, for me, it's like, well, we haven't done it yet. Yeah. And that's the problem. It's like, and they're kind of saying, well, yeah, but that's it. It's probably not too far off what was happening with climate change in the 80s and 90s, where they were like, well, show me the books, if there's no evidence for it, that, and it's like, well, that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to show it, because there's clearly enough evidence that there are sex differences in the incidence of different diseases and disorders and illnesses that I'm just trying to bring more evidence to bolster that, so we can move forward and try to move from this crude treat whatever disease happens to be in your system to most optimally treat you, the individual who has the disease.
Great stuff, Andrew. Yeah, that's some fantastic research, and I think everyone will be kind of refreshed to hear that you are part of a team who are some of the first people to be working on this. So thank you so much for finally telling us about all the crazy stuff you do, and keep it up. And I really want to I want you to keep us updated. This is really interesting stuff. Thank you.
Absolutely. I have a whole PhD to keep talking about, so there'll be years of these episodes. Don't you worry.
Can't wait. Okay. Right. Thanks, Andrew.
Bye-bye.